on the launch of our recent book on South-South financing options. My name is Richard Kozel-Wright. I'm the director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies here in UNCTAD. And it's a pleasure to moderate this panel with four excellent speakers who have made contributions to the volume. And I'll introduce them shortly. But let me make a couple of very brief introductory remarks. We've only got 1 hour, so I don't want to encroach on people's time. But this is ongoing work, collaborative work that UNCTAD and GDP Center are doing on financing for development issues. It's part of, to borrow a phrase, it's part of an ongoing beautiful friendship. The collaboration, though, was born out of our mutual frustration with the way in which the multilateral financial system has evolved over the recent years, not only with respect to longer-term development finance, but also with respect to balance of payments finance, with respect to the management or indeed the mismanagement of capital flows. We both see a system that has essentially become unfit for purpose, not only with respect to the original mandate that these institutions were tasked with back in 1944, but also with the subsequent development and environmental challenges that were not part of the original design of the multilateral system. And so that's a real sense of frustration. And the book, however, I think reflects a certain excitement that we both have with recent efforts coming out of the South itself to respond to that frustration and to find solutions of their own making to these challenges within the financial system. And of course, for us, this goes back, in UNCTAD, this goes back to the new international economic order. South-South cooperation was very much a product of the efforts of developing countries back in the 1970s to fashion a different type of international order. It wasn't successful, but it does mean that South-South cooperation is very much part of UNCTAD's DNA, and the issues that are discussed in the book, particularly around regional development options, have been a long-standing part of the work that UNCTAD has done over the years, indeed over the decades, and colleagues will present some of the findings on these kinds of issues shortly. And just lastly, I think there's also an implicit critique in the volume, an important one, on the current discussions around reform of the international financial architecture. I guess many of you are fully aware of all these discussions of the billions to trillions literature coming out of the World Bank, what Daniela Gabor has called the Wall Street consensus, and I think that's very much reflected in the volume. Important to say always, though, and it's one that UNCTAD always stresses, South-South cooperation is not a substitute for the multilateral financial system, or indeed for debates around the need to reform that system to make it genuinely development friendly. And that's work that we're also doing with Kevin and the GDP Center, for example, around our work on the Geneva Principles for a Global Green New Deal, which is ongoing work that we have together. So those are just some introductory remarks to the volume. There are four presenters. Let me just present them now, so I don't have to do that later. And we'll kick off with Diana Barraclough, who is one of the co-editors of the volume, indeed the main person responsible, I would say, for that volume. She's a senior economist in UNCTAD's Globalization and Development Strategies division, working extensively on our trade and development, our annual trade and development report, and her work covers a whole broad range of issues, but more recently focused on the interaction of finance and structural transformation. And Diana will kick off. She will be followed by Luna Ramos, who is a postdoc at the GDP Center and completed her PhD at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I know her co-author Rogerio Studart is a little bit timid and unassuming kind of character. So we're very happy that Luna can substitute for Rogério too. Finally, but by no means least, Mahui Lim is a rare breed. He's one of the few people that has crossed over from the dark side of private finance to the light of civil society. And he is currently the chairman of the Third World Network in Penang in Malaysia. But he has worked extensively and very important work on Asian financial markets and integration in the Asian region. Mahui has a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in the United States. So those are our 4 presenters. You can put in your questions and your comments into the Q&A or the chat, and I will pick those up during the presentations, and I will pose questions at the end of the presentations to the 4 presenters. The presenters have around 8 minutes to present their pieces, and at the end of that, I will come back and we can have some sort of Q&A in the final 20 minutes of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to give the screen to Diana to open up the presentations. Diana, you have the screen.
Thank you everyone, and thank you very much for joining us and being here today. We're very excited about this new publication. We would normally be able to show you hard copies. They're sitting in a box in the Palais, which is we're not allowed to enter at the moment, but hopefully that will change soon. I would let me share with you the screen where I have some. Oh, we had them a minute ago. I'm sorry about that. So if I can you all see this? Yes, you can see it, thank you. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the birth of this project and why we did this at all in the first place. So UNCTAD member states requested of us information about what they were seeing as the start of a new trend, a very exciting trend, perhaps the most exciting trend in finance in many years. And this was the birth of Southern-led institutions, Southern-led national banks and Southern-led multilateral development banks. That it appeared this was a very exciting new trend that's really changing the landscape of finance. The member states said to us, we want to have more information about how we can use the incipient start of these institutions. We need more access to funds for long-term development. We need less conditions on the money that we've offered. We want a voice. We want a voice in these institutions with a voting that's commensurate with our economic weight. We want money which is suited to our needs and our, what we can feasibly cope with. And essentially, they wanted alternatives to the existing multilateral order. Now, as Richard said, we're not examining the South-South institutions as the panacea to all the problems with the multilateral financial institutions, but they have been a powerful and very important contribution to providing what developing countries need. At the same time as the rise of the financial institutions, there's also a broader rise in South-South integration with respect to trade and with investment and sense of solidarity across many other avenues, partly a result of the 1980s Asian crisis, where countries were still bruised and shocked many years after that event, the Latin American crisis. So out of all this frustration, but at the same time, a more positive impetus, which is these growing foreign reserves that could be used, that can be used for other purposes. So now what we see today, this is 20 years after the start of this trend, where many of us working from homes, as you can see, we're sitting in lockdown environment in the COVID period. Now we're having a new period for South-led banks. And the institutions that have grown in the last decade are playing a very important role in the COVID recovery and response too. They responded quickly with large sums of money to the needs of their members. So what we're seeing is that The relief story from COVID is one aspect of it, but the other story is the need for structural transformation. And this has really come to the fore now in the last months with the wake up that we're all getting about the need to be more green and green investment. And public banks are driving that, and the South public banks are going to be a major part in that. So that's the birth of the book. Let me just tell you my job now I just put my stopwatch on. So I have about another 4 minutes left to go. So gosh, that was fast. So my job is to tell you very quickly the story that comes through out of all these 11 chapters that my wonderful co-authors and co-editors have produced. And I want to trace an arc, starting with the rationale for the regional integration and finance. We talked a bit about why developing countries wanted to have Southern-led banks. It's worth thinking in the first moment why they need banks at all. Why do we need banks to provide long-term finance? And that's a very important part of this book, where we show the role of banks in creating capital and then guiding it to areas where private sector financial institutions won't be able to do that. So even in the good times, even in the profitable times, the private banks have not invested in productive needs and structural transformation. It's been public and it's been from the South. So what's so special? Let me take the third point on my slide. What's so special about Southern banks? So I'm going to take you to the next slide. How do I move to my next slide? Okay. Sorry, take you to my next slide. One of the things that's been special about South-South banking is that it's creating a new center of gravity in the landscape of long-term finance. So in this graph, I just want to take a quick look at it. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at the ownership of banks. And this is by share of voting ownership of banks. And so we see that banks in the South emerging, or some have been there for a very long time, but they are beefing up. So we have the Islamic Development Bank, we have the African Development Bank, we have the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Latin American CAF. These are all owned by the South and also lending primarily to the South. So that's been really important. The development of these Southern banks has led to a new center of gravity. They've also doubled the amount of capital that was available. Okay, so we saw doubling of the amount of capital certainly over the last 2 decades, and even in the COVID experience, just the 3 biggest Southern-led banks lent the same amount of money within 3 or 4 months as did the World Bank for COVID recovery. So just 3 banks lending a lot of money very fast, so they're responding to the need quickly. They also offer finance, as well as finance, they offer technical expertise and experience. Now, the story that we're getting from all our various chapters in the book, we have chapters on India, on Africa, Latin American examples. We find a story in here of new institutions that are offering something different. It's not only more money, it's also money for different kinds of uses. So more likely to be for green investment, for example, more likely to be to borrowers who are less able to attract private finance. The sense of solidarity that comes with South-South banking can also have real tangible benefits, as regional Southern banks can borrow at much cheaper rates than even their countries can borrow. So the Islamic Development Bank with a AAA rating, some of its members are rated 12 grades below that at -B or B-. The CAF in Latin America is a AA- bank. Some of its members are rated at B. So solidarity brings power in the market to being able to borrow at cheaper rates. What we also find is our colleagues from Latin American example, Luna Ramos, will explain to us the story of the Latin American development of banks. What we also find, of course, is that there are notes of caution. Oh, sorry, that was my 8-minute timer. So if you just give me a minute, I'll keep going a little bit.
I have 7 for you. I have 7 for you, Diana, but go on.
Oh, good. Okay. I knew my clock was fast. So this sense of scale, this is one of the big stories that comes out of this book, is the sense of scale. And some of this is surprising, that the chapter by Gallagher shows us that the biggest source of development finance in Latin America are two banks from China. So the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. They have been massive investors even from before the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And they can complement rather than compete with other forms of development finance. But let's go back to my next slide. But we also want to show, as I said, a note of caution. So we're in the middle of the list. There are notes of caution with this exciting story. Expectations are very high and the demands are very high. But at the same time, many countries are still massively underserved. Some of the banks have got extremely conservative approaches to lending. We have a chapter in the book by my former UNCTAD colleague, Ricardo Gottschalk and Daniel Poon, and they show ways that these banks could be less conservative, could gear up their lending. They're still lending very low ratios compared to, for example, the banks in China, which are much more generous in their lending. And the problem is that they still have a conservative approach because of the grip of the credit rating agencies. So we have a discussion in the book about how do we get away this tension from development banks trying to fulfill a developmental mandate and still to placate credit rating agencies, which are needed for access to capital. I said not all regions are equally served. In fact, not all regions are pulling in the same direction. So we have a very nice chapter on the case in India by C.P. Chandrasekhar or Chandru, who traces the arc of history of Indian public banking and says, why are these Indian banks not a big Southern leader like we would expect? And he explains how there's been fundamental and negative changes in India's financial structure. What?
A minute, 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Now this was important because the Indian financial sector was not able to put the same kind of COVID recovery responses in place that other countries were, which had strong and well-funded development banks. So the next post I want to focus on quickly, evolving processes. None of these banks were born overnight. They're not born in a vacuum. They're nested in a broader political context. So Chinese lending in Latin America did not start with the Asian Infrastructure Bank. No, they'd been doing it for a very long time. The East Asian story, we will hear from Ma Hui Lim. Again, this is a story that goes over 20 years. And it's important to think about how much time these things take, which we saw also in the COVID case, where the banks who had long histories were able to beef up quite quickly and respond quickly to the needs of their countries. So what else is needed now? We have a lovely chapter, 2 chapters on Latin America by Riccardo Caccioffi and Andre Biancarelli. And they both say it's not just about money. You need to have strong demand side emphasis as well. And this will come by having regional plans and strong government and intra-regional trade and infrastructure that projects that are across boundaries and that can talk to each other. So the final thing I just want to talk about is changing mindsets. So the potential of these Southern banks can only be realized if they don't fall into the old prejudices and modus operandi of traditional and historical multilateral banks. And this is not about technical issues, it's about politics and mindset. And many of the chapters tell this story that we need to be able to give support to the public banks. We need politicians to support the banks they own, and we need banks to be allowed to be developmental and to follow performance requirements that are not just narrowly financial. It's the same as a private sector bank would be. So I will finish for now. Thank you very much. I turn over to our next speaker.
Right, Diana, thanks. Thank you very much. A lot of important issues there, not least whether we're really moving away from a system that has been dominated by US finance and US hegemony, which raises lots of questions. Before we get there, Luma, you will talk about your chapter on the Latin American experience. So you have 8 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah, I've tried to be quite brief. I was training something like 5, so I think that is quite well. Oh, first of all, it's an honor to be here speaking in this panel with all you guys. This chapter I wrote with Rogerio, that unfortunately he can't be here with us today. So this is a joint effort that we made. And there is no matter that I can substitute him in the same level, high level of him. But I will try to point some subjects that is important to think right now. And I will make my considerations in two main subjects. The first one is why Latin America needs a South and South alliance. And the second is how should this alliance work? First of all, the prospects to Latin America aren't good. According to ECLAC, the region GDP declined 8% in 2020. The COVID pandemic exacerbated inequalities and put millions to the poverty. Latin America will face a fragile and uneven recovery. But even before, and this is something that we discuss in the book, and Diana also made points a lot of times in the books in terms of the chapters, is even before the sanitary crisis, Latin America suffers with some struggle, economic and social difficulties. And here I'm talking about some structural imbalance, high investment needs, especially in infrastructure, and fiscal capacity bottlenecks. Well, so right now we have some massive challenge. Besides the COVID, we have all this history of bottlenecks and necessity of finance. So how surpass this? Well, also ECLAC has some leads to this matter, and I think that this is why we are discussing here today. One way is to investments in smart policies and a strong and effective multilateral system that places people at the heart of social economics efforts. Well, this is very beautiful, but it's also very hard to put in motion. Well, and to push this very difficult task, I think that Latin America has a long history about public banks, financing development, financing big projects. Due to the lack of private resource funds, we have like big public banks, multilateral, national and multilateral banks that fill this space. Well, I'm here citing some examples. BNDES is the global lending leader for green energy sector in the world. And almost 50% of all climate funds in Latin America in 2019 was provided by multilateral, bilateral, and national development banks. So these banks, this structure, this financial structure that we have there, that we have here, it's so important to us. And also, like Richard told, we are not here proposing some kind of disruptive change, but we are proposing something like alliances, partnership between these new and very important institutions, multilateral institutions, also with the locally current institutions. And this is the way that we think about South and South cooperation in Latin America. We have these new organizations also present some opportunities, some alternatives, because we have like a different kind of governance. And also Diana said in the COVID crisis, we have like some very fast and quickly solving resources to this country, responding. And this is when you face some bottlenecks and some demands like we have here in Latin America, this is very important to have like this flexibility in new ways of governance and new ways of ownership. Because right now the changes, the ways of decisions are made is different. This South and South cooperation, this alliance offer a new way of make decisions. And this is very important. And according to, and here it's some parts of the agreement of NDB, one of the efforts is to strengthen cooperation among BRICS, and we supplement the efforts of multilateral and regional financing institutions for global development, thus contributing to collective commitments for achieving the goal of a strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Well, we have here such an ample and important mandate, and this is it is the key to Latin America, to support a sustainable and balanced growth. But the way that this partnership could work, it's above. We have not to think like, okay, they have like this huge amount of financial resource. we have to think beyond that, as Diana said previously also. We have to think, okay, how we can, and this we discussed also in the chapter, we have to think how these structures can help with technical and technological capacities. And this is, and how this will help us to create pipelines of projects. And one of way is the creation of special originates platforms dedicated to identify potential projects and mitigate uncertainty associated to this kind of project, this transformative project. They came with a lot of risks and uncertainty. So have a technical assistance is also important to this partnership. And just
2 minutes, Luma.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on my last bullet and my last question. And how should this alliance work? Well, Latin America suffers a lot by the lack of long-term public institutions due to corruption or there is not self-sustainable institutions. So a key feature to these institutions to work and to be important to us is to have sound balance sheets and self-sustainable institutions. They are key to pave like a long-term development, to pave like long-term projects. So this is very important. And besides that, demand-led instruments. Again, I quote Diana, in the middle of the response to the crisis, we have like these quick responses was very important. And also it's important to have another ways of develop financial instruments that have innovative conditionalities and requirements that fit with demand and project specificities. We have to think outside the box, the toolbox of instruments that we have today, and how we can figure it out better ways to match sector dynamics, how changes in transition risks, and how these investments would fit this new world, this new technological changes. So here we are talking about different costs and different ways of long terms, grace period, and how some instruments could be different and make difference. Because to be effective, they need to fit the demand structure. So, and this will also help to face the uncertainties that we have here. So yeah, that's all. I think that it's a very, optimistic way to think this cooperation, but also I think that is an alternative to the moment that Latin America is suffering right now. Thank you, Richard.
Luma, thank you. Yeah, there's question. Of course, there's always questions of why the private banks are so bad in Latin America, which requires public banks to play a role, and what the nature of the partnerships that you can create with private banks given their history. That's an interesting question.
We need another hour to discuss this.
Another analysis. Thank you. Mahui, can you now give your presentation?
Yeah, are you able to see the PowerPoint or not?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh
no.
Boy, I'm not sure. It's filling up my screen.
Go to the bottom and hit share screen.
Share screen, yeah, there should be a share screen. The green.
I know, but the problem is now this thing is taking up all the space of my computer. I don't see. Okay. I put the share screen.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what happened? Oh, share.
Well,
is it coming up?
It should be. Yeah, there you go.
Is it up?
Yeah.
Is it up? Right? Okay.
You need to put it on. You need to put it on. You know, you need to change it to a single screen.
I don't know how to do that.
Hit the button called slideshow on the top.
Yeah.
Comments. Normal. Or maybe this one.
Yeah,
this
that one. Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. I will share the experience of Asia in coming up with the regional financial architecture, which is born out of the failure of the international financial architecture to address the problems arising from the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. And then after that, I will talk about what are the twin pillars of the regional financial architecture, the RFA. Okay. The origins of the Asian RFA with the Chiang Mai Initiative. All of us know about the Asian financial crisis in 1997, which sent many countries into a tailspin. And at that time, Japan mooted and proposed a $100 billion Asian monetary fund to throw a kind of a lifeline to these countries. However, it was vociferously rejected by the US and the IMF because they did not want any challenge to their international dominance. And they couch it in the language that, oh, we want to avoid the moral hazards of these people going around looking and shopping for loans. And out of that frustration, then the ASEAN established a very modest bilateral swap agreement, BSA, bilateral swap agreement, was only for $100 million. But it was, it was never used and it was not really up and coming. So essentially, many countries in Asia turned to the IMF for rescue. Then 3 years later, at the ADB's AGM in Chiang Mai in 2000, the Asian finance ministers agreed to increase the bilateral swap arrangement to $1 billion facility. And this is what is the birth of the Chiang Mai Initiative. Now, there are two pillars of regional financial architecture. I call them the defensive pillar and the developmental pillar. The defensive pillar consists of 3 legs. The first is crisis prevention. And the Asian finance ministers as well as central bankers get together by annually, at least twice a year, to exchange ideas and information and all that about each other's economy. And then they have, office to do surveillance of each of the economy and the monitoring of the financial and economic health of the economy. And then finally to do early warning system. And only a few years later, they set up an international office called AMRO, ASEAN +3. The +3 is China, South Korea, and Japan. Okay? The ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office, which came into being established in 2011, and it's based in Singapore. So this is the practices for the crisis prevention. Then you have the crisis management leg, which is when the countries get into trouble, they are thrown a lifeline of swap facilities. And over the 20, 30 years, the amount of swap arrangements facilities went up to $240 billion. Okay? But I will say that this has never been used. And then finally, there's crisis resolution when countries get into trouble. How do they get out? And this should be talking about sovereign debt restructuring. However, no effort has been made on this front, and it is something that is badly needed. Now I'll move to the developmental pillar, which is the thrust of this book, which is to provide long-term financing. Now, one of the lessons for the Asian financial crisis was they said that there was too much emphasis on banking sector, and that they were plagued with this problem of double mismatch of maturity and currency mismatch. And hence, the international financial institutions, and particularly ADB, push for the development of the local currency bond market as a form of finance, long-term financing, and also where their borrowers will not take on any currency risk. However, and this is just a graph to show the exponential increase in the size of the local currency bond market. This ASEAN +2, which is minus Japan. Okay? It went from $830 billion to $16 trillion in about 20 years. That's 19 times, so it's huge. And the red is the corporate issuance of bonds, local currency bonds, and the gray is the government. And you can see that the government is issuing 2/3 of local currency bonds, whereas corporates issue still the foreign currency bonds. Now, the big problem, and here I will say, with this so-called solution, is that it is not a solution for the crisis, because when your bond market is substantially owned by foreigners, then you do have a major problem of exit, by foreigners in times of crisis. For example, in Malaysia, up to 30%, over 30% of the government bonds are held by foreigners. And in Indonesia, up to 40%. So this is a big problem. And in contrast, the Japanese JGB bond market is only about 12% foreign owned. And 10 years ago, it was only 6% foreign owned. So this is a major problem. So there is, pardon my dog barking, and asking me to stop. There is a big trade-off between liquidity
2 minutes,
and financial.
2 minutes.
Okay, and I'm done, almost the last 2 slides. There is a big trade-off between liquidity and financial stability. Bonds are long-term, lending in maturity, but they are highly liquid, which means they can be liquidated at any time. In fact, the raison d'etre of bond and capital market is to be able to dip in and dip out at any moment. And therefore, this phenomenon presents what I call the fallacy of composition, that a local currency bond solves or eliminates the currency risk for individual borrowers. That's true. From an individual borrower's point of view, they don't take the currency risk because the currency risk is taken by the investor. But then this risk is transferred to the system, the whole economic system and financial system, because when there is crisis in advanced economies, and all the or a major part of what we call the investors want to withdraw and sell their bonds, that will bring down the price of bond, increase the rates of interest, and bring down and leads to a massive devaluation of currency, and therefore all the knock-on effects for the financial system as well as the economic system. I'm on the last slide. And it is a sad story that in their rush and to develop the capital market as a spare tire, which I basically say is not really a spare tire. The spare tire can go flat very, very easily because of large foreign component ownership. That they have neglected a rich tradition in Asia of development banks playing critical role in the development of countries. Japan had the long-term credit bank, South Korea has the Korean Development Bank, Singapore as the Development Bank of Singapore. And my final slide is that the principles of Development Bank, they should not just focus on infrastructure, which is what I think AIIB does. I think they should also nurture SMEs, which are big players, I mean, in terms of number of people employed in many of these economies. And what business models should they adopt? They should definitely move away from maximizing profit to what I call the triple objectives of people, planet, and profit, meeting social needs, environmentally sustainable projects, and so profit, which is the thing must be financially sustainable, but it must be a socially acceptable rate of return. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahui. That's a very different notion of PPPs than many people associate with their acronym. Can I, if people have questions, please, can you put them in the Q&A so we can have a little time at the end for questions. But last but not least, Kevin, you have the screen for the final presentation.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Richard. And while I'm sharing my screen, let me just echo what Richard said earlier, and to really thank Diana Barraclough, who took the lead on this, on editing this book, and did a great job. We have copies in our office too, and they look just terrific. I also want to give a shout out to two of our other colleagues at the GDP Center that have a chapter in the book. Rebecca Ray and Rohini Kamal have an interesting analysis that compares the CAF, or the Development Bank of Latin America, and the Islamic Development Bank. I looked at in my chapter, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, not globally, but just in Latin America. Our center at the GDP Center has a whole research cluster called the Global China Initiative that looks at these two institutions globally, and maybe we can share some of that in the chat. But the chapter I wrote was specific to Latin America. I'll make 5 points in case Richard tells me I run out of time. One, in Latin America, Chinese development banks are really the new banks in town that provide among the largest amounts of development finance now in Latin America, especially in the infrastructure space. I did an econometric analysis in the paper and find that Chinese development finance is largely determined by a drive for China to diversify its foreign exchange holdings, to gain access to foreign markets, to gain access to resources and technology, and not the least of which to help Latin American nations develop along a China model that's based more on infrastructure, structural change, and manufacturing. China's development finance is very important for growth in the region and for filling the infrastructure gaps in the region, which are glaring. However, Chinese development finance, almost endemically, given the fact the sectors that it's in, also accentuates many of the risks in the region related to debt distress, biodiversity loss, climate change, and social conflict. Like Li Minhui said, it's important to make sure that we're maximizing for people, the planet, and structural transformation. And I have some recommendations on how China and host countries should put in place policies to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. This just shows, and it's updated. So if you know anything about book publishing, you write these papers a couple of years, and it takes a while for books to come out. But here at the GDP Center, we have a joint interactive database with the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, where we update this on a regular basis. So the numbers are a little different than what's in the book. But since 2005, the China Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank have provided upwards of $136 billion to Latin American governments since 2005. As you can see here on the right, in a study that we released in an interactive yesterday, that's really tapered off since 2016. There were some years, 2015, where these two banks provided more financing than the CAF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank combined. But it's really started to cascade off, and in 2020 there were zero, partly because of COVID, obviously. the composition has largely been in infrastructure, manufacturing, and mining, and brings real benefits to the region. It's obviously led to a stepwise increase in the availability of development finance. It has high potential economic gains. The World Bank did an analysis that showed that these projects have the potential to deliver about 3 times the economic benefits than, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was on offer for some countries in the region. It offers a different model of development. As Diana said, the China development banks aren't competing, especially with the IADB or the World Bank, because they're not really into infrastructure until very recently. So it's moving into infrastructure and manufacturing. It's enhancing South-South conditionality. One thing the countries in the region really appreciate is that it doesn't have policy conditionality. You don't get a loan for a particular project on condition that you're making some kind of policy changes across the board on trade, privatization, and so forth. And it gives countries more choice. So if you want to get something financed, you can go to the Chinese banks, you can go to the Brazilian Development Bank, you can go to the Western-backed banks and have more competition among what you're looking for. But there's also real risks and benefits for that threaten some of these benefits. These aren't always just specific to China, but when you're dealing with large infrastructure projects, there's lots of risks. One thing that should be noted is that all of Chinese overseas development finance, or 99% of it, is denominated in dollars. So it suffers from some of the same currency risks. A lot of it is heavily weighed in the coal sector, which new plants in coal will not be economically viable over their 40-year period. So both China and host countries will be stuck with stranded assets over time. And in another book that we released last year called Development Banks in the Andean Amazon, we find that China invests a lot in hydroelectric power plants in the Andean Amazon, which the deforestation related to that is almost emits as much as coal plants, and leads to a lot of social conflicts with indigenous peoples in those regions. Unlike some of its counterparts in the book, China defers those kind of due diligence processes to the host countries. Sometimes we find that the host countries put in place those due diligence themselves, and the China development banks are the first to comply. However, when those countries aren't putting those in place, China isn't there to backstop that. And that's often led to a lot of project delays and so forth. One thing that should be noted in the narrative now, even though many countries that we have something called the China Overseas Development Finance Database that shows that many countries have a large proportion of their overseas debt right now in exposure to China. That's not really the case in Latin America. The Latin America debt crisis is largely one about bondholders and commercial banks. As you can see, bilateral finance is only about 16% of it. There's a handful of countries, Ecuador, Jamaica, and of course, Venezuela, with heavy exposure to China. But the debt crisis in Latin America is one that is a New York and London problem, not a Beijing problem. Finally, and this needs to be updated, but I used the criteria of the International Development Finance Club, which is a Southern-led organization of development banks that has committed to converting their balance sheets toward green finance, and they created a scaling criteria. This is also used in the article about the CAF and the IDB. And unfortunately, the composition of Chinese overseas development finance in Latin America is the least green. As you can see at the very bottom here, according to their own classifications, only about 9% of it is green. And there's a controversy in the International Development Finance Club about the extent to which hydroelectric power should always be seen as green. As I noted before, when hydroelectric power in Indonesia or say Brazil, Bolivia, or Ecuador is in the middle of the Amazon, you could be spurring in significant deforestation, which causes emissions higher than gas, not as much as coal, as I mentioned before, but pretty significantly, and therefore perhaps even that 9% needs to be cut down a little bit. That said, China has invested in the largest solar power plant in Latin America. A couple of years ago, a major power plant in Argentina. So it shows that China has the ability for green structural transformation, but hasn't been engaged in that yet. Countries and China should be maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks. Host countries need upstream planning to prioritize the kinds of projects they want. And they need to make sure that there's compulsory risk analysis and due diligence, and that they're aligned with the SDGs, Paris, and broader inclusive and green development. If those are the kinds of projects they put on offer, China will finance them. China also needs to incorporate some of these due diligence and risk analyses into their own overseas operations in those situations where countries aren't doing it on the host country end, and align their balance sheet as well. Thanks so much. You can find a lot of other research on this on our webpage, and follow me on Twitter. Thank you so much, Richard.
Kevin, thanks a lot. We've got 10 minutes to go. There's quite a few very specific questions on China that maybe Kevin will want to answer. You can directly answer in the chat. There are a couple of general questions which I'll pose really, and people. One of them from Nimrod is the question of how what are the mechanisms to capitalize development banks? It's a real problem in Africa, and Nimrod, I know, has done work on that, obviously coming from South Africa. I mean, what mechanisms from the various studies that you've been doing would you think are the ways to go in terms of ensuring the necessary capital base for development banks so that they can scale up in the way that you've all been talking about? Maybe I don't know. Maybe Luma. I mean, because the BNDES is a unique one in this respect. It's an important one, and it is a huge one. I mean, what are the mechanisms that BNDES has been used to be able to scale up to the extent that it has?
Actually, BNDES has a lot of in this toolbox. First, we have to talk about the funding of BNDES. So when you are discussing here how we want these southern institutions, we have to think about funding as well. So we have, like in this NDB and others, we have some donors. The countries donor some amount of resource, but in BNDES we have like this public source, and then it is a stable source of funding. And these we have, besides that, we have a self-sustainable bank. So besides this stable source of funding, there is like a key message. We have like a self-sustained bank that, and well, what mechanisms? I think that in the past, like I said, BNDES is the leader in green energy in the world. So he is above a lot of other institutions. So it's a key player. And one thing that I recently wrote about is about the energy sector in Brazil and how BNDES evolved together. And when I talk about something about the demand-led instrument, I was talking about how the change in dynamic, specifically I was talking about some regulatory change at the price and how energy was being traded in Brazil, and how the BNDES mechanism changed together with this to follow these dynamics. So to mitigate some kind of uncertainty that arose, that rising from this change in how the energy was traded in Brazil, BNDES also changed how the instruments of the financial instruments dealt with it. So when I talk about financial innovations and demand-led instruments, I was talking about this. And this, I think, that is a great instrument. And we have some other countries, and as Lynn told about some small and medium enterprise, we saw a lot of these mechanisms, some new mechanisms put on motion in Latin America, first of all, and principally after the COVID crisis. So we can see a lot of these dynamics, a lot of innovative mechanisms that put on motion in Latin America after the COVID crisis. And I think this is a nice way and a nice example to other banks and to other countries as well.
And Mahui, I mean, is that, what about Asia? I mean, you know, the Japan, I think Japan is a very neglected case. The reconstruction of post-war Japan and the role of public finance seems to be neglected in a lot of discussions. And I wonder what the lessons are when you talked about this need to build up development banks. But I mean, Japan had them and they were very significant to the reconstruction of post-war Japan. Are there lessons there for you know, for developing countries from some of these experiences?
Yes, I think that's quite a strange thing that Japan basically, after financial liberalization in the 1990s, essentially accepted the Anglo-Saxon IMF model of no, their type of more capital market type of banking system. And I don't know why they are not pushing their model, which actually, you know, they played a very, very important role. I don't think, you know, the economy of Japan could have recovered post-World War without those long-term credit banks, both government as well as private sector long-term banks, right, playing a role. And there is a question by Gul Unal, you know, that he says that assuming foreign investors will hesitate to come in the presence of capital controls, what is the alternative? I think the alternative is to, I'm not saying that we have to completely shut off the bond market and all that. That's unrealistic. But I think we need to understand that there is a big price to pay. And I think we can tackle it on two fronts. That is, you can have capital control management. And I think the South-South countries should cooperate rather than compete with one another in this area, you know. So capital controls, China, was able to have, still able to have capital controls, and still investors who want to invest in China. So I think that we should, share lessons from one another. And the other one, of course, is still, as I said, Asia has got so much money. Why don't they channel some of it into, as the book suggests, into this development banks? The development banks should play a more important role than just leaving it to capital markets.
We're running out. There is a. I think it's an important question. I think it was Nina about really whether South-South does provide a way of overcoming financial subordination. It raises a question maybe for Kevin and Diana to, obviously a lot of the important dynamism of South-South finance does come from the rise of China. That there's absolutely no doubt. And the Belt and Road is an important initiative that does combine finance with other elements of the development story, trade and foreign investment, etc. And Kevin's talked a little bit about the pros and cons of Chinese finance. Where do you see that going? Is the evolution of the Belt and Road and the institutions and instruments on the Belt and Road a real opportunity to extend South-South cooperation in a way that does break what for many is still a position of financial subordination in the international financial system? Or are there real concerns that some developing countries have expressed that subordination can just shift from one hegemon to one aspiring hegemon?
I think the Belt Road Initiative offers incredible opportunities for countries, but this is a large finance for large projects and large potential transformation, and anything of that scale also has a lot of risks. And like I said, it's the challenge of each country and each region to try to maximize the potential benefits with all of this. You have more sources of finance for more kinds of economic activity than you used to have. But you have to play it right and you have to be strategic. And that has the same thing on the China end. Right now, the Belt Road Initiative, a woman on our team wrote a book about the Belt Road Initiative last year and characterizes it as a really fragmented process. That it's really this let 1,000 flowers bloom, go out there and do financing. And even on the China side, they need to get more strategic about how they do it. They did an incredible port project in Greece. And so now there's 100 Chinese port projects all across the Mediterranean, and all of those will hurt each other's competition. So countries really need to put in place due diligence, have their own plans, ask the Chinese for it, ask the Asian Development Bank for it, ask local national development banks for it, and you can get healthy competition either to finance different pieces of it or to get the best offer across all three of them. I think another question in the chat. I mean, one of the things we have to realize that there's a new study last year. We know now that there's about 400 development banks in the world. Their collective balance sheets are about $13 trillion. But it's true that the top 10 of them are about 70% of them: China, KfW, Brazilian National Development Bank, World Bank, and so forth. Just because you're small doesn't mean that you're insignificant. And one of the things that we start to talk about in this book and have started to talk about elsewhere is that there's a lot of South-South cooperation. Doesn't necessarily just mean a bilateral loan from a Southern Development Bank, is that there should be more platforms for these institutions to work together. Often the national development banks are smaller in capital and higher in price, but they know the players, they know the local environment, they have the connections with the strategic opportunities of a host country, and they could be co-financing more with the China Development Bank, with the African Development Bank, and so forth, and creating platforms where different development bank institutions that can bring different things to the table, whether it be due diligence, credit enhancing, or things around social and environmental safeguards, and actual capital that countries need to. If you have your own plan, you can bring some of these things together. Your own national development bank can help leverage finance in, doesn't have to do it all by itself, and don't have to only work on bilateral deals. Thanks so much.
Diana, I'll give you the final word. You want to follow up perhaps on some of Kevin's ideas? You're muted.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I'll just make one comment that sort of wraps some of those issues together. And it is a point which comes out in many chapters of the book, and it relates to political will. Now, so the question of, financial subordination, the concern about, what will happen if you can't repay your loan, who gets paid next. These are, first thing is that if the countries are relying on bond markets, there's no question of being able to restructure or renegotiate. Your loan is just flicked off to somebody else. And so that's obviously a very bad position to be in if you're the holder of debt. So the role of a South-South bank, where you actually got a bank, not just a bond market, supporting you, where you have people who are following your project, that is obviously potentially much more useful for moving forward and more productive. And the question about political will comes when we think about other examples in the regional financial architecture where no members of banks have defaulted on loans. So no members of the FLA have ever defaulted on loans. The number of defaults on loans that we understand from ISDB or some of the other development banks are low, because these are member-driven institutions where they're all borrowers, they're all likely to be borrowers. And so there's a big effort to not default. So some of these issues about, subordination and the concerns that can be, if not resolved, they can at least be negotiated because you have a political will to do so. It's in your interest. And then thinking about, how to use those institutions for more scaling up and for broader use. Nimrod mentioned the DBSA. I mean, the DBSA is the biggest bank in Africa, but it's very small compared to, for example, the NDB with which it could partner. And it's very small compared to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, trillions of dollars that it could, why does it not have access to these funds? These are public funds that are not being used developmentally. So again, this is something about political will that maybe could be, the southern countries need to get together and do something about this. And at the same time, you need political will to let the banks be developmental. The DBSA has got very low gearing. They're not even able to use all the funds they have in the way that they could perhaps if they had government support that would allow them to be more developmental. So all of these things come together both at the national level and at the regional level. That's all.
Okay, Diana, great. Thank you very much. I have to wrap it up. We've gone over the allotted time. I would just say that this is not the end of the discussion around new sources of finance. It's really very much the beginnings of a discussion, and a lot of the work that we're doing is readily available on both the website of the GDP Center and on UNCTAD's own website. So I would encourage people to explore both of those for further research and work that we're both doing together and separately around the issues of financing for development and the challenges that developing countries face, not only in the context of COVID, but also delivering on the sustainable development agenda and traditional development challenges. So let me just close by thanking the four presenters for their contributions, and for you all for listening and providing questions. If there are any outstanding, I guess colleagues may well be available to further answer those questions. But let me just thank you all for participating, and hopefully we'll have more of these seminars over the course of the year, and we look forward to further discussions on these and related issues. So have a good afternoon and evening wherever you are. Thank you. Thanks a lot.